DA leader John Steenhuisen has told citizens to vote with their heads, not their emotions. The party hosted its final rally on Saturday at Mary Fitzgerald Square in Johannesburg. Meanwhile, the party's leader was caught in yet another controversial scandal that centers race politics. Just 2 weeks ago, the DA had to remove campaign posters in Phoenix after public outrage about the racial messaging. This week, Steenhusien and Gareth Cliff told One Movement SA member Mudzuli Rakhivhane that race is irrelevant in local government elections. Professor Steven Friedman argues that the Democratic Alliance is becoming the poster child of the right wing. He joins me now. Professor Friedman, good morning. Thank you for speaking to us. Just unpack for us that statement in which you said, or asked the question rhetorically, I presume, the DA is becoming the poster child of the right.
Good morning, Hugo. Thank you. Yeah, the point I was making there, if you look around the world today, the right wing has changed its tune. Not that long ago, right-wingers were against democracy, they were against free speech, and they were for racism. And now they claim to be in favor of democracy and free speech and against racism. But actually, what they're saying is that they should have free speech in order to be racist, and that racism is what people who are opposed to racism do, not what racists do. And in South Africa, that tends to translate into racism is what black people do, because whenever black people complain that white people are being racist, then that's racism. If you say anything critical about white people in the suburbs, that is racism. And if you have a look at the DA messages which are being sent out, they're very much like that. If you have a look at Helen Zille's tweets, for example, they're very much about why do you criticize colonialism? There was nothing wrong with it. You're more racist than we are because there were more racial laws under apartheid. And then, of course, we have the Phoenix poster incident, which also the message of the posters are black people are racist. People who have a problem with black people are not racist. And Steenhuisen, of course, has still not apologized for those posters. The chair of the DA in KZN apologized for them. Steenhuisen insists it's fine because the ANC are the real racists. And Mike Waters, who doesn't hold a post in the DA anymore, but was its deputy chief whip in Parliament, says this is all part of an intolerant campaign by sanctimonious people who, in effect, what he's saying, if you look at the international scene, is that they want white people to feel guilty. And the DA is very much part of that. And the DA is increasingly becoming the party which says what right-wingers around the world say. My sense is that that's not going down very well with a lot of DA supporters.
Now, both Gareth Cliff and John Steenhuisen agree around a report in which they suggest that a lot of individuals, particularly those that are voting in local government elections, are not particularly concerned with race issues. What is your comment there, Professor?
Well, you see, that's part of the trend that I'm talking about. I mean, it sounds like a non-racial statement. But what it actually says is, don't complain about the fact that there's still racism against black people in South Africa. Don't raise it as an election issue, because then you're bringing race into it. We're a racially unequal society. We've been that since 1652. We had a political change in 1994, which meant that everybody stood a citizen, but it didn't get rid of racism against black people. And so that if you continually make this point, it's got nothing to do with race, then you're continually saying, well, we don't have any, we don't want to talk about the fact, that black people are still very often subjected to the same kind of racial attitudes as they were before 1994, because for obvious reasons, the DA doesn't want to talk about that. Very interesting. It doesn't cause controversy. I find the slogan, you should vote with your heart, your head rather than your heart, very interesting. Because what does it tell you? It tells you the nice suburban people who vote for the DA are the people who have heads. They're the brainy people. They're not the emotional people. The people who vote for other parties and who are mainly people in townships and shack settlements are the people who don't really have heads. They only have hearts. So we've always got to be very sensitive to the way in which what sounds like a non-racial message is actually a message saying, look, let's just not talk about racism, because if you talk about racism, you're a racist.
Now, will people vote on racial lines in these local government elections, do you think? And I'm going to give you a little scenario. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues yesterday, and she said to me her parents are torn. Well, her mum says, I'm voting DA because she feels that they deliver on services in the area in which she lives. And her dad says, no, I dislike the racial connotations that I'm picking up from the DA, so I'm not voting DA.
Well, I think if you look at all the evidence we have, you'll see that that person's dad is a lot more in tune with majority thinking than their mum. I'm not saying that their mother has the right to vote for whoever she wishes to vote for. But I mean, if you look at what's been happening in our politics over the last 10 years, etc., it is quite clear that many people who have traditionally voted for the ANC are not happy with the ANC. Yet they do not switch, for example, to a party like the DA. They usually just stay at home if they're unhappy. And the reason for that is that they don't like the DA's racial baggage. And this is across the board, you know. We tend to think that there are these stereotypes, you know, that black people in townships and shack settlements, you know, as I say, vote en bloc without thinking, and white people think about this. If you take out the fact that there are domestic workers living in the suburbs who don't vote for the DA, then the kind of votes that the DA gets in the posh suburbs is much greater than the vote that the ANC gets in the townships. So what is that telling you? It's telling you that people in the suburbs like the DA because they like that racial message. The majority of people in this country don't like the racial message. And I'm not being crude about this. I'm not saying that it's purely about race, because if it's purely about race, then what the person you were speaking to's mother said would not have been said. You know, there are people, you know, people do bring other calculations into this. But the fact that we are still a racially divided society plays a huge role in the way in which South Africans vote. And it's simply ignoring reality to pretend otherwise.
Professor, let's shift gears and talk about messaging by the political parties. The DA have talked about getting things done. The ANC has suggested that they've learnt from their mistakes and would like another mandate to govern. The EFF is talking about jobs and land. Manji, what do you make of this messaging? And is it likely to sway voters in any particular direction?
Look, I think the messaging is interesting in the sense that in terms of our theme, the DA is saying we've done everything right. The ANC is admitting that they've done a great deal wrong. You know, it's very difficult to tell afterwards how people were motivated. What I will say is that ANC slogan does, I think, reflect more what voters are thinking than the DA slogan, because the DA slogan assumes that voters are happy, or their voters are happy. And what we do seem to be hearing in reports quite consistently is that the DA's own polls, like the ANC's own polls, tell them that they're actually losing support. So if that is correct, both the ANC and the DA are being told that they're losing support. The ANC, as one might expect, is reacting to that by saying, look, we understand why you're angry with us. We think we can do better. The DA is in effect saying, it doesn't matter if you think that we're doing badly. We think we're doing well. I think that, and of course the EFF is trying to position itself in a different space to all of that. And saying, well, look, unlike these two who are telling you that they did badly or well, we actually have a program, and our program is land and housing. Now, I think that's very interesting because many people in South Africa want land and housing and don't have it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be that moved by the EFF slogan, because slogans for all the parties only work if people trust that you're actually going to be able to live up to that slogan. Now, rightly or wrongly, I think a lot of people look at what the EFF is saying and say, look, I agree with that, but I just don't think that they're going to make it happen. So there's a mix. I don't think those slogans are irrelevant. I think that they do have an impact on voters. But voters will take the slogans into account a lot along with some other things, like the racial issues we've been talking about, like their sense of whether they actually trust the party to do what the party says it's going to do. So it's a factor, but it's obviously not the only factor.
And finally, before we let you go, Professor, there have been a significant number of independent candidates that will be contesting in the local government elections. Does this speak to a lot of the voters seemingly swaying away from the tried and tested parties and opting now for independent candidates? Are we likely to see a huge number of those voted into positions of office?
I doubt it. You always hear, on Facebook and Twitter, you hear people saying, I'm going to vote for the independents this time. But, I often say that if Facebook and Twitter were the country, the EFF would be the government. So you can't judge from that. I think the reason we are seeing lots of independent candidates is because, particularly since the Constitutional Court's judgment saying that we need to allow independent candidates at national, provincial level, I think there is an atmosphere in the country which suggests that there's an opportunity for independent candidates. And certainly, as I indicated earlier, there's a lot of dissatisfaction among voters, ANC voters, DA voters, etc. So in theory, the independents should do well. I'm just not so sure because party loyalties in this country are just very strong. And even if people switch parties, they tend to like the idea of independent candidates in principle, but not so much in practice. So I'm keeping an open mind on this, but I'd be a little surprised if the independent candidates did nearly as well as the atmosphere at the moment says they're going to do.
Professor Friedman, always appreciate your time and insights. That was political analyst Professor Steven Friedman giving us his insights into that upcoming election on November 1st.